Hello and welcome to the Science or Fiction podcast Neuroscience Edition. In this special series, we will interview experts to separate the science from the fiction in headlines and media coverage of neuroscience research. I'm Chloe Carrick, a PhD researcher at King's College London in adolescent brain development.
And I'm Anushka Day, a youth advisor for this neuroscience series. And this is the Science or Fiction podcast.
Hi Anushka, it's very exciting to have you on the podcast today as our co-interviewer.
Thank you. It's been so fun to work behind the scenes and now I'm finally on the podcast.
Yeah, you've been doing such a great job. So for our listeners, Anushka has been a brilliant youth advisor. So you've been producing the episodes with myself and with Catherine, including working on today's episode, which is about Huntington's disease. So Anushka, had you heard about Huntington's disease before starting this episode?
So I've heard a bit about Huntington's disease. I know that it is a neurodegenerative disease. So I know that Alzheimer's is also a neurodegenerative disease. So maybe it's like that, but it's also a little bit rarer. And I've also seen a lot about Huntington's in the news recently.
Yeah, me too. No, I hadn't known much about it before researching for this episode, but one of the main reasons why we wanted to cover it today is that there's been a lot of focus on it in media, in social media as well. Mainly that families who are affected by the disease have been given hope after a long time because there's been what the media is saying, at least a successful treatment, or that it's been successfully treated. And this, I guess, got us thinking, can you successfully treat neurodegenerative diseases? What does that involve?
Yeah, so is a treatment the same thing as a cure?
Which is like a really interesting question and one that I don't know how to answer. So should we get our expert on?
Yes, absolutely.
Today, we are talking about the neurodegenerative condition Huntington's disease. You might have recently seen headlines about a new gene therapy that appears to slow the progression of Huntington's, with reports stating that it's been successfully treated for the first time. But what is a neurodegenerative disease like Huntington's? What did this new treatment involve? And why is it being called a breakthrough? What is the difference between a treatment and a cure?
To help us explore these questions, we're joined today by Professor Rachael Scahill, Associate Director of the Huntington's Disease Centre at University College London. Hi Rachel, thanks so much for joining us today.
Hi, nice to be here.
Before we get into more detail about the study itself, could you clarify what actually is a neurodegenerative disease and how is Huntington's different from other more common neurodegenerative diseases like Alzheimer's?
So neurodegenerative diseases are those where there is progressive degeneration of the neurons, essentially. And depending on where that degeneration is in the brain, that will result in different conditions. So Parkinson's, Alzheimer's, multiple sclerosis, Huntington's disease, these are all degenerative conditions, but different areas of the brain will be affected by the pathology. Alzheimer's disease, as you say, is the more common form, it's most common form of dementia, and that is caused by the buildup of toxic protein and the neuronal cells degenerate. People will be familiar with the way Alzheimer's presents. It's typically memory loss, and it's an area of the brain called the hippocampus that is affected. Usually, in Alzheimer's disease, the form is what we call sporadic. So people will get it in their 80s. It's not that they haven't inherited it from their family. And the biggest risk factor for Alzheimer's disease is actually age. There is a more unusual form, as I say, that I did my PhD in, where it is inherited in what we call an autosomal dominant way. So if you have an affected parent, you have a 50% chance of inheriting the disorder. But as I say, that is rare in Alzheimer's disease. In Huntington's disease, that is the typical form of the disease. So it is autosomal dominant. If you have a parent affected by Huntington's disease, you have a 50% chance of inheriting the disease. You can have a genetic test to find out in advance whether you're going to get the disease. That's a very personal decision. It's a very difficult decision. Another major difference with Huntington's disease from Alzheimer's is that it typically affects movement early on. That's how it's characterized. It does also affect cognitive processes and neuropsychiatric function, but it doesn't typically have the sort of loss of memory that we associate with Alzheimer's disease.
Okay, so it seems like, so you mentioned different brain areas that are affected potentially between, let's say, Alzheimer's and Huntington's disease, but then also the main, I guess, difference is that inherited components, that there's this genetic basis for Huntington's disease, more so than you might see for on the majority Alzheimer's disease. And even though I guess there is that genetic basis for Huntington's disease, I was wondering as well, like, is there a lot of variation within Huntington's disease itself in symptoms and progression?
There is, and there's variability around the age of onset, so we can very roughly predict when people are going to get the disease. It's caused by a triplet repeat in the DNA, a CAG repeat, and when it's too long, it affects the protein Huntington, and it basically becomes toxic. The longer your CAG expansion, the earlier you're going to get it. But there is still a lot of variability around that. And as I mentioned, there were sort of three main characteristics. You get motor problems, cognitive problems, and neuropsychiatric features, but they will have different emphasis in different people. So sometimes the cognitive features will come out earlier, sometimes the motor features will come out earlier. So there's a lot of heterogeneity, and we don't necessarily understand what contributes to that variability.
Could you explain a little bit more to me what that means with CAG? So is this CAG expansion, what is the mechanism that is at work there?
Yes, so it's sometimes referred to as like a stutter in the DNA. Okay. So there's a section of the DNA where we've all got a number of CAG repeats in our Huntington gene. We all have the Huntington gene. The average number of repeats is around about 17, but you can have up to 30, 35 repeats and be unaffected by Huntington's disease. If you have more than 40 repeats, that affects the formation of the protein that is coded by the DNA. So it's a toxic form of the protein. The area where you've got 35 to 40 repeats is a bit more of a grey area. You may get it later on in life, or you may also have an increased risk of passing it on to your children, because it can expand even further as it passes down the generations. So it's essentially a bit of the DNA where the stretch of the DNA is too long, so the stretch of your protein is too long, and it just doesn't fold properly, and it doesn't work as well as the normal form of the protein, which, as I say, we all have. And that malformed protein can become toxic, and eventually it can cause neuronal death.
We've seen that Huntington's disease, at least headlines say, it's been successfully treated for the first time with an experimental gene therapy. So I was wondering, can you explain a bit about what a gene therapy is, and then what the results of this trial showed?
Yes, of course. So gene therapy is essentially where you try and sort of manipulate the expression of genes. So we know that DNA codes for a protein, and in the case of Huntington's disease, this protein is toxic. So in the case of this gene therapy, a gene is injected directly into the brain. So it's a surgical procedure. It takes 10, 15 hours, it's a really long process, and a drug is infused directly into the center of the brain. And essentially there's a virus that carries that gene, and this produces a compound which lowers the expression of Huntington, the toxic protein. It's important to say it's actually, as well as lowering the toxic protein, it also lowers the normal form of the protein. So we get, as you know, we get genes, one from our mum, one from our dad, and Huntington's disease people would just have one gene that's affected and the other one produces normal Huntington. So this therapy lowers both. So it's important to stress that it's not just targeted at the toxic protein, but it does seem to be well tolerated, and there don't seem to be any harmful effects of lowering all those both forms of the protein.
An invasive brain surgery, then you're saying? Yeah.
It is, and it's a one-off treatment. So this is permanent change to the cells in the body. So the people who underwent this therapy were incredibly brave because it was really, really high risk, more so than some of the other treatments that have been tested to date. So it's, as I say, it's a permanent alteration where it effectively lowers the amount of the toxic protein. The results came out when they came out, they're incredibly exciting. So the headline results are that this treatment slows disease progression by 75%. So that is as measured by a measure we use called the Composite Unified Huntington's Disease Rating Scale. So it's a clinical scale of how people are getting on in terms of their movements, etc. So this was slowed by 75%, which is huge. There was also a slowing of 60% on the scale called the total functional capacity. That's a measure of how people are getting on in terms of their daily life. Can they still work? Can they still look after their finances, etc.? So 60% slowing on that measure. And then and that's obviously about how people feel and how people are doing. But importantly, there was also a measure of a protein within the brain, neurofilament light, which is a measure of neuronal injury. So this typically goes up in neurodegenerative conditions. After this treatment, the level of NFL, neurofilament light, was below the starting point before the surgery. So it seems, and this all makes sense, it all adds together to suggest that this is having a very positive effect, not only on the sort of pathology, but actually importantly in the clinical benefit to the individuals undergoing the treatment.
Right. Okay. So I'm going to try and summarize then, based on what I've learned. So when you have Huntington's disease, that means that it's like a DNA glitch almost, yes, where exactly. You have this protein that's being produced, but it's the bad form of Huntington protein, right? Yeah. And that protein is usually involved in, you said, like neuronal upkeep, or like, is it for, so what does that usually do?
Huntington normally has we don't completely understand its role actually, but it does seem to have a role within the cell in terms of axonal transport and things. We know it's really important in development. So if you knock out Huntington in development, then that is fatal. So it seems to have a variety of functions, right. But it's essential, and as I say, we all have it.
Okay, but then with Huntington's disease, you have this toxic form, basically, and
exactly.
That's what's causing this range of symptoms that you described. So for this treatment, then, we're trying to stop the production of that toxic
exactly.
form.
Yeah.
Okay, and then we saw as well that this was a small trial. So there was 29 patients that this was carried out with, and it was also carried out with a gene therapy company, so Unicure. Yes. So I wondered, do we have to be careful then with the interpretation, so how we're interpreting the results from this trial? And is it common that gene therapy companies run these trials rather than academics?
It is fairly common for companies like this to run small phase 1 trials in small numbers. They usually work quite closely with academia, but often things have been developed in partnership. But it is quite usual for them to run trials like this. But you are right that we do need to be cautious. These results are based on a press release. And what we typically like as scientists is peer-reviewed journal articles where other people will have looked at your work, said, oh, you've missed this bit out, or, what else don't we know that the uniQure inevitably have complete control over the press release that they give, as long as it's factually correct. But it's more that there are some results that we don't yet know about that we would really like to hear about. For example, you can measure the levels of mutant Huntington. That wasn't reported, even though that is the target of the drug. So we wait to hear about that. We also want to see what the MRIs look like. It's slightly confounded by the fact that when you're undergoing brain surgery, that in itself can distort things within the brain. So we don't know quite what our typical measures in the brain may be messed up by the process of the way the treatment is administered, but we still want to see that data. So I suspect when it goes for peer review, there will be still quite a few questions about it, and it's always worth bearing in mind that this is based on a press release from the drug company themselves.
Right.
So then when it comes to uniQure's involvement within the trial, to what extent are they involved? Do they just fund it, or are they in control over more things?
So they will be in control of designing the trial, but this will have been done in discussion with lots of different people, including regulatory bodies. So they won't have done it in isolation. It always has to be well designed. They will have statisticians on board to advise them about the numbers they need, how things are set up, how regular people need to be assessed, etc. So yes, they were in control of the trial, but it was very much done in collaboration with other people, and it will always have been ethical, scientifically sound, etc.
It's quite interesting though, isn't it? Like, it's a good point, Anushka, that you raised, because like we're so used to, as academics, thinking about this slow process of conducting research, and how it's, as researchers, you take your time. Things take a lot of time to go through the whole process, but then we need the money from these companies to actually, get these sort of treatments expedited, I suppose. Yeah.
We do. We have to be realistic about this. And in uniQure are quite a small company, but inevitably, if this is successful, it will likely be bought out by a much bigger pharmaceutical company. That's what happened in the case. The previous sort of biggest news in Huntington's disease was a compound called tominersen, which was again trying to lower the mutant Huntington, but it wasn't done through surgery. It wasn't done through gene therapy. But there was a small phase 1 trial done by a small biotech company that was then bought out by Roche, who took it to a phase 3. So even those small biotech companies who maybe have a little bit more freedom in terms of how they, what they pursue, how they design things, it then inevitably is passed on to large pharmaceutical companies, who are really the only ones who are in a position to run these trials with hundreds of people and lots of money. We have to be realistic about this. So the best we can do is work in partnership with them, really.
Right.
And I think there has been a lot of discussion along the way with academics. And for example, my boss, Sarah Tabrizi, is on the scientific advisory board. So she will have an influence over how they design the trial.
I think it's really reassuring to hear, especially when there's a lot of anxiety around the idea that companies who are obviously looking to make a profit are involved with something as personal as healthcare. So it's reassuring to hear that, they don't have full control over everything. There are so many academics involved within the scientific process, and it is really necessary to be able to get out trials and to be able to look at potentially life-changing cures and treatments.
Yeah, I mean, one other thing about the Huntington's disease community, as I said, it's a very rare disease. So drug companies need patients, and the only way you're going to get patients is through academics, through clinics, and we insist on patients being treated properly with respect, and that it is about their treatment and something positive for them, not just about profit, or certainly that's our angle. While we recognise and are grateful for the involvement of pharmaceutical companies, we like to still protect our patients and make sure that things are the best for them.
Yeah, and I just wanted to go back to something you'd said as well about just the results of the trial. So you talked about how the headlines had said that this has slowed the progression of the disease by up to 75%, I think you said, and you explained a bit about what that meant. But we had the question about, well, what's the difference then between slowing the progression of a disease and actually curing a disease?
It's a really good question. You know, what we'd really like to do for a cure is to permanently stop the protein being produced. And that would involve, you know, manipulating the DNA itself, which is ideal, but is really problematic. It's really, really difficult to do. There are people working on that sort of approach, but it's actually easier from a technical point of view to interfere with the protein production process. So there are many steps to that, and there are different approaches attacking different parts of that process. So while we await potentially sometime in the future a permanent cure, what we're working on is delaying onset or delaying progression. So if you think of people who carry the Huntington's disease gene, who expect to get to see symptoms in their 40s or 50s, if we can tell them that they don't expect to see those signs until their 70s, 60s or 70s, although that's not a cure, that is effectively a treatment for them. They're then, you know, like everybody else, you know, we can all get all sorts of things in our 70s and 80s, and they can live a relatively normal, full life. So while that might not actually be completely obliterating the toxic protein, it is it's an effective treatment for those people who are at the moment facing the fact that, you know, if you think in your 40s, you've still got so much life to live, you may have children, that sort of thing. If you think you could live into your 70s, then, you know, most people would take that. So that is an effective treatment, I would say.
Reading scientific papers, you look at the implications of all of these results, and they can be quite narrow, focused on the fact that, especially with these headlines as well, like, we've slowed the progression, and that's obviously such a massive, great thing. But the practicalities for someone living with Huntington's, thinking, maybe when could this even become a big, widespread thing? What does this mean for me? It's really, you know, you don't tend to think about that quite often. So then also, when it comes to these broader implications from this trial, what can we take for people with Huntington's? What are we looking at moving forwards?
Yeah, so I think the big news, which would seem to be undisputable, is that if you lower the toxic protein, we believe that results in a clinical benefit. So that is huge news. Whether people end up having surgical intervention, you know, or there are other drug companies pursuing a similar approach, and maybe you get a tablet to do the same thing, or maybe you have a lumbar puncture every 6 months, etc. There are a multitude of different approaches being pursued at the moment, but that proof of concept that if you attack the protein, you get clinical benefit is huge, and we've not really had that before. So the implications for the Huntington's disease community, whether they have that drug or another drug, is massive. There are also implications for other neurodegenerative conditions. A lot of the other conditions are also protein misfolding disorders. Certainly that's the case in Alzheimer's disease. So, and just proof that delivery of a gene through a viral vector has been successful, that can be translated to many different conditions. So, you know, in the same way we have vaccines that we can tweak to a particular, you know, pathogen that's relevant at the time, the technology, once you have the technology, you can then adapt it for lots of different conditions. So I think it's got really huge implications, and we await further details of this particular trial, but I don't think anything detracts from that linking of changing the protein and clinical benefit.
Right. So has this been done before then? So like this sort of gene therapy approach for neurodegenerative diseases, is this why this is such a breakthrough, being described as such a breakthrough for neurodegeneration?
So it has been done in some other conditions. So gene therapy can also do things like introduce a missing protein. So one of the there are lots of other conditions, including childhood conditions, where a protein's been missing or defective, and a therapy can be introduced, gene therapy, to produce that protein. So it has already been used quite widely in a range of conditions. We're still waiting on other things for, say, Alzheimer's disease and Huntington's, etc. But that is all in the process. So it can be frustrating, I think, for people who have these diseases, that how long it takes the whole process. You know, we've had a breakthrough now. When will that actually translate to somebody else with another condition? It does take a long time, but once the technology's there, there are a whole host of possibilities.
Yeah. Could you maybe get into that a tiny bit, maybe just briefly, on how logistically we go from like the results of this trial now to actually someone getting a treatment using this method for Huntington's disease?
Yes. So this has been a phase 1, early phase trial. In a very small number of participants. They are actually now doing it in a few more people, and you know, in a few years we'll have some more results. But the company want to now get regulatory approval. So before, at the moment, we would say no drug is licensed for Huntington's disease, no disease modifying drug. There are treatments for some of the symptoms, but there's no disease modifying treatment is licensed for it. So to get it licensed, you need to conduct a number of clinical trials. You need to demonstrate it in a larger cohort. Even if it is then licensed by a regulatory authority, so for example, in the United States, it's the Food and Drugs Administration, the FDA. There's also the European Medicines Agency, or MHRA, in the UK. So these different bodies that you need to get to accept that this is a suitable drug, that this is a safe drug, that it's an effective drug. You then, within that country, that a health service or insurance companies need to accept that they will pay for it. So this is a huge hurdle. So in the UK, we have NICE, the National Institute for Clinical Excellence, who will make a decision about whether the NHS should adopt this treatment. And they will bear in mind that it is very expensive, but they will also factor in that actually, if you don't have to, if the National Health Service doesn't have to care for somebody with Huntington's disease for 20 years, you know, from their 40 to 60 or whatever, the burden on the NHS of looking after someone like that is also huge and also very costly. And another factor is that person not working for 20 years. That has a financial impact on the country. So NICE are very good at taking into account all those things and then deciding whether the National Health Service should adopt it. Is it a cost-effective treatment? So they're sort of the hurdles that we have to go before it becomes widely available. So I think there'll be more trials of larger groups. We need regulatory approval, and then we need each country to say, yes, this is an effective, costly treatment to roll out to people. It may well be to just a small group of patients in terms of they choose their criteria. It might be a certain age group or people who've got a certain disease burden. It won't necessarily be available to everybody. It depends. It depends on the drug. It depends on lots of things.
Right. So it's a very promising first step, the results from this trial.
Absolutely.
But there's
Yes.
a lot of other steps to follow in the near future then.
Totally. And I think if people are interested in this topic, there's a really good article on HD Buzz, which provides sort of lay summaries of what's going on in Huntington's disease. And they described this as the first domino to fall. And I think that's a really useful way of thinking about it. It's not the definitive answer in itself, but it sets so many things in motion that means that in the next few years, we really hope we'll have an effective treatment for Huntington's disease.
Great. We will link that, for the listeners as well.
Great.
Rachel, you've summarized all of that so well, and it's so nice to hear that there's something so promising, but also really understand all of the different things that go into a trial like this, and really be able to understand how we can interpret this as well.
Thank you so much for coming on and for answering our questions today.
I'm delighted to, and I'm just glad to raise awareness of Huntington's disease as well. So they're a very special community of people.
Thank you for listening. We hope you enjoyed this episode. Make sure you subscribe to the newsletter at scienceorfiction.co.uk, and please rate and subscribe in your favourite podcast platform too. If you have a suggestion for a future topic, DM us on social media at Science or Fiction Podcast, or you can email us at info@scienceorfiction.co.uk. This episode was produced by myself and Anushka Day as part of our neuroscience series. And thank you to the youth advisory groups for their input on this series too. See you all next time.